Hi everyone, welcome to a discussion of Virgil's Aeneid, books 1 and 2. I just wanted to say before we get started with the Aeneid that in these videos where I'm talking about specific books, I'm going to be talking mostly about poetic devices, themes of the epic poem, and other things that you'll need to know as far as cultural context, and I'll only be talking briefly about the content that you've actually read for any given day. I'm going to try to hit the high points that I want you to really pay attention to, but I'm not going to discuss them in detail like we normally do in class. So you'll be responsible for doing that on your own. So let's get down to business with books 1 and 2, which you've read for today. As with all the other epics, we're going to start out by talking about the prologue, the first 10 or 11 lines of the poem. And what's interesting to note about the prologue to the Aeneid is that the first 3 words are the most important. Arma virumque cano. And this translates, as Lombardo puts, arms I sing and a man. Or, more literally, arms and a man I sing. And then we get a relative clause, who was the first to come to Italy as a fugitive of fate from Troy. So if you remember in our discussions of the Iliad and the Odyssey, the Iliad begins with the word menon, or rage, right, and takes the theme of war and Achilles' rage as its central subject. And then the first word of the Odyssey is andra, which means man. And so these directly map onto what Virgil is saying here in the first 3 words. He's saying, I'm going to sing about arms, or war, and a virum, a man. Okay? And so he does this on purpose, in that the first half of the Aeneid is going to be shaped around the story of Odysseus and Homer's Odyssey. It's going to be the telling of the wandering of Aeneas and all the impediments that he hits before he actually gets to the shores of Italy to found what will become Rome. Okay? And then the second half of the epic is concerned with the arms, with the war, with Aeneas' war with the Latin peoples. And so right off the bat, Virgil is situating himself in this Homeric tradition. Okay? He's borrowing heavily from Homer, and he will continue to borrow heavily from Homer throughout the epic. Next, I want you to notice the word cano, or I sing. That's the Latin word for I sing. And here, as opposed to in Homer, Virgil is taking on a lot of agency, right? So Homer always invokes the muses. Muses, tell me about this. For instance, in the Odyssey, andra moi enepe musa, like, muses, tell me about the man. We don't get that here. Virgil's saying, I'm the one that's going to be telling this story. So he's taking on the agency of an author, which is very revolutionary for this period of literature, and very, very different from what we've seen in Homer and in Beowulf. We also get some shout-outs to what's going to be very important as we continue reading the epic. So Virgil immediately tells us it's going to be about Aeneas' journey from the shores of Troy to Italy and everything that happens in between, and then also the war that takes place after he gets there. Okay, so he says, okay, this is a man who is going to be suffering greatly in war, and on account of Juno's relentless wrath, okay, which primarily takes up the first half of the epic. All of this that we're about to read in books 1 through 6 is because of Juno, essentially. But after that, he is going to go ahead and found his city, and specifically, he's going to bring his gods into Latium. Latium is another word for the area that Rome sits in, and that Aeneas is going to foster the Latin people, which Virgil calls his Alban forefathers. Alban is another geographical term. That's a place in Italy. And he's going to create the high walls of everlasting Rome. Okay, so here Virgil lays out a map, essentially, for the entire epic. He says what we're going to start with, what's going to happen in the middle, and then what's going to come at the end. So this whole epic poem really looks ahead to what happens at the end and what the end causes. Which is maybe easier to see then how this epic is a national epic, and that it explains why Rome is the way it is and how the Roman people came to be. So as I said before, books 1 through 6 are kind of modeled after the Odyssey, right, where we focus on the man himself, his journey from Troy, the impediments he hits along the way. We're going to meet a woman named Dido in the city Carthage, okay, and that's going to be the focus of future discussions, especially surrounding the political situation and the political relationship between Rome and Carthage at the time that the epic was written, and finally about his arrival in Italy and what happens then. So then in books 7 through 12, we get the Iliad half of the epic, okay, which is focused on the menon, the rage, or the arma, the weapons, So all of this is really just about war and what it takes to found the future site of Rome, right? And so you might say, well, why is the Iliad, or why are books 7 through 12 all about war? What does that tell us about Rome? Well, it explains why Rome is so good in war, right? When we think about the Roman Empire going and conquering lots and lots of people, and what Augustus is doing at the time of the writing of this epic, war was a large part of Roman identity, and that's probably why it features so heavily in the second half of the epic. So let's discuss the high points of Book 1. All of the action is set in place by Juno's wrath. She's mad at Aeneas and at the Trojans themselves for reasons that we see in the Iliad and hear about in the Odyssey, but also because of something that I'm not sure we talked about yet, but something called the Judgment of Paris. Okay, so Paris was chosen to settle a contest between Minerva, Juno, and Venus, okay, and to figure out which one was the most beautiful, right? Which goddess was the most beautiful. And so each goddess offered him something different. Venus offered him the most beautiful woman on earth, Helen, the one he ends up choosing. Juno offers him lots of power and like ruling a rulership over lots of people, okay, because she's connected with royalty and kingship. And then Minerva offers him battle prowess and the ability to do crazy feats in battle and basically to have lots of Aristeas. And so he ends up choosing Venus and he gets Helen, and that sets the whole Trojan War into effect. But Hera, or Juno, is one of the most jealous goddesses that we see in literature, and she holds a grudge to the end of her days. And we see that played out here in the Aeneid, in that she sets all of the action into motion because of that grudge. So she gets Aeolus to whip up a bunch of winds and destroy a lot of Aeneas' crew and send him flying all over the place, which is semi-successful. But then Neptune comes into the aid of Aeneas, not necessarily for Aeneas' sake, but because Aeolus has trumped his power over the sea and the sea storms, the sea winds. Okay, and so there's a nice simile connecting Neptune to a Roman statesman and an orator, a speaker. And this seems to be incredibly Roman. This is not a kind of simile that you would get in Homer or in a Greek poem, but this is specifically kind of a Roman literary feature. So after this, we get Venus, who is Aeneas' mother, going to beseech Jupiter for help and saying, don't let Aeneas die. He has this great destiny. You said he was going to do all these amazing things. Was all of that untrue? Or are you sticking to your word? And Jupiter then gives this very long, elaborate prophecy about Aeneas and the future of Rome. Okay, again, just like the prologue, this prophecy looks forward to the end of the poem, right? And what the poem is trying to explain. Why is Rome such a great nation? It's almost propaganda in a certain sense. So Jupiter says specifically that, let's see. Yes, so the lineage of Aeneas will build the walls of Mars and call the people after his own name. The Romans, well, he's talking about Romulus there. We get a specific kind of conflation of this Romulus-Remus myth, which is one myth for the origin of Rome, and the myth of Aeneas coming from Troy, which is another, just a kind of an alternate myth, right? We've talked a lot about alternate myths in this class. But Jupiter says, for these, the Romans, I set no limits in time or space and have given them eternal empire, world without end. Okay, so I think it's pretty clear to see there in this passage, which is on page 10 of your book, and that is lines right around line 330 of book 1. This passage really clearly demonstrates how the Aeneid is a national epic and how it is propagandistic for the Augustan regime, for Octavian, who has seized power and created this sort of new empire, because Jupiter is explicitly giving the Romans as a race power over the world. Now, this isn't to say that Aeneas won't face obstacles along his journey, the main one of which will be the Queen Dido of Carthage. Okay, so in book 1, we meet Dido for the first time. We learn a little bit about her past, right? So she's called Sidonian Dido. Sidon is a place that's very close to Tyre, where she's from, which was in the ancient kingdom of Phoenicia, and all of that is in modern-day Lebanon, okay? Just to put that into perspective. And Dido has created Carthage. She's founded this new city. So in a way, she's a parallel to Aeneas, but she's founded this new city called Carthage because she's fleeing from her brother Pygmalion, who killed her husband Sichaeus. Okay, so she's come to this new land, much like Aeneas is going to a new land to find new opportunities for their people. And so in book 2, we finally get the story of the Trojan horse, so hopefully you all enjoyed that. And we see specifically the story of a character named Laocoon, and Laocoon's fate is eventually to die at the hand of 2 snakes sent by Minerva for trying to kind of out the trick of the Greeks and the Trojan horse. Okay. We also get a little image of Hector's ghost. We learn about the fate of Priam. But most importantly, we learn about how Aeneas departed Troy. And this is a very kind of important scene that tells us a lot about Aeneas' character. Okay, so the 3 things that Aeneas escapes Troy with are his father, Anchises, his family gods, the Penates, which we'll talk about much more about later for Friday's video, I believe. And then he brings his son, Ascanius, right? And what does he leave behind? Well, his wife Creusa. So if this tells you anything about what a Roman man values, it is not his wife, it is his father, his son, and his family gods. And that is on purpose in this epic, very specifically. So Creusa, though, is kind of even more importantly portrayed as being a virtuous Roman woman who is willing to sacrifice her own life in order to prop up the goals and the kind of overarching destiny of her husband and her family. Okay, and we see lots of other stories about Roman women doing this. One is Lucretia, also Virginia, and I mean several others. So this is very much in line with Roman values and Roman thinking about like gender roles. So now that you've gotten a taste for Virgil and the Aeneid in books 1 and 2, we can talk about how Virgil is reshaping epic poetry and the epic tradition. Okay, so he's appropriating lots of Homeric themes, right? And that the first half of the Aeneid is like the Odyssey, and the second half is like the Iliad. But moreover, something you probably don't know is that he appropriates and draws heavily on a different epic poem called the Argonautica, which was written by Apollonius of Rhodes during the Hellenistic period. And so this was probably around like the 300s BCE. Okay, and the Argonautica heavily reworks Homer and tells the story of Jason and the Argonauts, which we sadly won't read in this class, but Homer draws from it heavily. Okay, and we also see further use of things like Xenia and the Nostoi, right? If you remember, that's the Greek word for the kind of homecoming poetry that we talked about when we talked about the Odyssey. But how does Virgil understand epic differently than Homer, and how is it different from Beowulf as well? Well, first off, it was written to be consumed by reading. So it was not written or composed orally. It might have been read publicly or performed in certain aspects and public conditions, but it was primarily meant to be read, not heard necessarily, even though it is still written in dactylic hexameter. So Virgil is different from Homer and Beowulf also in that he's got lots and lots of material to work from. So we've already talked about how he appropriates Homeric themes and Apollonius' Argonautica, but he also has other kind of past Latin poets to work from, as well as other Greek things such as tragedy, which features heavily in how Virgil tells the story of Dido and Aeneas. Okay, so that is primarily a tragic tale and works a lot from Greek tragedy. Lastly, there's a lot of political subtext, as I hope to have made clear by the first video talking about all of this craziness that's happening at the time of the writing of the Aeneid with Octavian and Julius Caesar and the expansion of Rome as a cultural and imperial entity.